1, 2, 3. Hey, this is my Lego snake. I googled it. And it's gray and white all the way up bottom to top. And the red tongue, blue eyes.
The people of Israel had been in the desert for a very long time. They had become irritable and grouchy as they traveled. They were constantly complaining.
Why did you go out of Egypt? We're going to die here in the desert. The food's terrible and we hardly have any water. We're always hungry and thirsty.
Then they started to find poisonous snakes in their camp. People were very frightened. Many people got bit and some even died. The people were upset and came to Moses saying,
We're sorry we've been so cranky. Ask God to take away these snakes.
Moses prayed for the people, and God said to Moses,
Make a snake and put it on a flagpole. Whoever is bitten and looks at it will live.
So Moses made a snake out of bronze and put it up on a pole. And whenever the snake bit somebody, that person would look at the snake made out of bronze and live.
Once upon a time, God, with the help of Moses, Miriam, and Aaron, and a lot of other brave leaders, freed the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt and led them into the desert on their way to a new land. While they were in the wilderness, the people became discouraged. There's no food, they cried. We haven't got any water. Besides, the food we do have tastes really bad. They started complaining and attacking Moses and God, saying things like, Why did you bring us out of Egypt? We're going to die. Do you even care about us? Has God forgotten about us? So God sent fiery serpents amongst them, and the people were terrified. Many were bitten by the snakes, and some people died. The people realized they had been wrong, and they came to Moses and asked him to pray for them, to pray that God would take away the fiery serpents. So Moses prayed and prayed and prayed. And God answered that prayer, but not in the way that anyone would have expected. God said, Make a fiery serpent and put it on a stick, and anyone who has been bitten should look at this serpent, and they will live. Moses was perplexed, but Moses did as God asked and created a serpent of bronze and put it on a stick. And just as God had said, anyone who was bitten and looked at the stick lived. Now, as Marcus Borg, a biblical scholar, often said, I don't know if it happened that way or not, but I know this is an important and truthful story. In the details, this story seems strange and even somewhat frightening. God sent fiery serpents to poison people who were complaining about the quality of the food in the desert. How does that fit with a loving God? I thought it was okay to talk to God about anything, even our grumblings and our complaints. And yet, as I was pondering this story this week, I had several moments of recognition that left me going, oh wow, that is so true. So come with me on a journey to consider what this passage reveals to us, not just about something that might once have happened a very long time ago, or might not have, but about something that happens all the time in human community and in our own hearts, and what God's response to that human tendency might be. You see, the people of Israel were ecstatic to leave Egypt and Pharaoh behind. They rejoiced in their newfound freedom. They even sang and danced after crossing the Red Sea. But then it got hard. Crossing the desert was beyond difficult. Food and water were scarce, and what food was available wasn't much to folks' liking. Tempers frayed, and the complaining started. Likely it started innocently enough, with someone saying, Arg, this manna is not very tasty. What would I give for a loaf of bread? Remember the bread we had in Egypt? And someone else might have said, I am so tired of traveling through this desert. Do you remember the Nile? That big river? All that water? what I wouldn't give for a sip of water just now. But it grew into something more malevolent and insidious. Soon everyone was murmuring, and Moses and the other leaders were beginning to grow afraid. What might the people do in their unhappiness? Leading the people had started to feel dangerous. And being part of the community wasn't much fun anymore either. No one danced, no one sang. All the people did was grumble and complain about everything that was wrong. When they started out, people were glad of their freedom. Sometimes they would pause to notice the magnificence of the stars or the beauty of the sunrise. When the manna first fell from the sky to feed them, everyone gave thanks. But now all anyone talked about was how bad things were. And the more people talked about how bad things were, the worse everyone felt. You see, it doesn't take fiery snakes falling from the sky to make such a situation poisonous. Being part of a group that is complaining all the time about everything creates a toxic environment. Moses and the other leaders are right to be afraid. This is the kind of context where people start looking for scapegoats. After all, it's very easy to imagine that we will feel better if we can just find someone to blame for this mess. Perhaps you have experienced something of that kind of poisonous situation. Maybe you have encountered a church where nothing ever seemed to please people. Perhaps you walked into a community group or classroom and went, wow, this feels tense. Or maybe your workplace was like that, or a group of friends, or even your family. Usually it starts innocently enough, with some sort of frustration or misunderstanding. But then the negativity starts to take on a life of its own, and it grows and grows and grows until it starts killing the group of people who are infected with it. Of course, that death may not be literal. It could be the death of passion, of gratitude, of hope. People might start quitting the group, and new people would be very hard to recruit. No one wants to be part of something that just feels icky. Negativity and blaming becomes a powerful, if perhaps hidden, destructive force. And when you encounter it, you feel like you are walking through a field full of poisonous snakes waiting to bite you. Canadians of Asian heritage have experienced firsthand during this pandemic how stressed people can misdirect their frustration at inappropriate targets in ways that are painful and sometimes frightening. Children in the schoolyard are being accused of causing or spreading COVID-19. Dr. Teresa Tam, a Chinese immigrant, has been accused of not being loyal to Canada. Other medical officers of health who are people of color have been subject to harassment and even death threats. Someone had a sign in the back of their truck that said, "Swear word off China," driving around town. Not this town, but another town in Canada. Another person wore a mask in a grocery store that said, "Thank you, China." And it required a courageous teenager to confront them about how inappropriate that was. The poisonous snakes of racism have flourished during this pandemic. Poisonous snakes can also have a way of lurking in our inner hearts and minds at times as well. Often when we are hurting, we can become our own worst enemies, ruminating over and over again on our pain, or by contrast, desperately trying to avoid thinking about it at all and denying that anyone or anything is hurt. Yet neither of these approaches generally leads to healing or wholeness. Emotional and spiritual pain is not dissimilar to physical pain. It's just that the injuries are less visible and perhaps less honored in our culture. In fact, there is now scientific research that suggests that many of the same receptors in our brains are involved in responding to emotional and spiritual pain as are involved in responding to physical pain. Consider for a moment if you fell off your bike and skinned your knee. My guess is that most of us have had an injury like that at one time or another. If you ignore the injury and don't take the time to clean out all the gravel and crap out of it, and perhaps bandage it depending on how deep it is, then you run the risk of getting an infection. On the other hand, if you spend next week doing nothing but focusing on your skinned knee, that's not likely to be too great for you either. The same is true of emotional or spiritual pain. If you ignore your grief, your fears, your hurt, your disappointment, your regret, your shame, your guilt, well, those feelings don't miraculously go away. Instead, like an untended cut, they are more likely to become infected, potentially poisoning our hearts and minds. On the other hand, if you spend all day, every day focused on your pain, that's not likely to be very healing either. So the journey towards healing, whether it is as an individual or a community, begins by noticing and acknowledging what's going on. You have to identify the snakes. The people of Israel need to come to Moses and say, Moses, we have a problem with grumbling and a problem with poisonous snakes. Can you pray about it and ask God to help? And in the same way, we often need to name the challenges we are facing as communities and individuals. Am I feeling grief? Am I anxious? Why might I be angry? Is our workplace struggling with gossip? Are people talking about their concerns informally in the parking lot at the meeting after the meeting, rather than in the meeting where we could work together towards solutions? Are historic patterns of injustice like racism or homophobia or sexism or transphobia part of the dynamic of what is happening? Is bullying part of the dynamic here? And yes, bullying happens amongst adults too, and dealing with it is different than dealing with conflict. Just like the first step in treating a physical ailment is to come to a correct, or at least mostly correct, diagnosis, we need to do that about our mental, spiritual, and community health as well. Then, once we have an inkling of what is happening, we should take it to God in prayer, like Moses does. Sometimes we make the mistake of believing that prayer is a way of changing God's mind about things, when usually what prayer changes is us. As we see ourselves and our situations reflected in the light of God's love, we begin to understand differently, and we begin to find the freedom to grow and heal and change. Now, you don't have to fully know or understand what the snakes are all about before you pray. Often, in fact, prayer can be very helpful in identifying them. So if you have a sense that you have walked into a situation full of snakes, or that snakes are starting to circulate in your heart or mind, prayer is an excellent option. Don't be surprised, however, if the answer you get in prayer is a little like the strange answer Moses gets in this story. God tells Moses to hold up that which is afflicting them so that they can look at it and be healed. And it turns out that healing often comes by looking at what is going on and moving through it, not by avoiding it. Take grief, for example. Grief is a universal human emotion. If you love people, you will experience grief. Yet grieving people sometimes receive unhelpful advice to stay positive or move on. However, the only way through grief is by grieving. We grow more resilient, more compassionate, and eventually more able to find joy and new life after a loss, not by pretending that everything is all right, but by finding those places and people who allow us to express our sorrow and acknowledge the hole that has opened up in our hearts. Grief suppressed takes way longer to heal than grief expressed. And the transformation of unhealthy dynamics in families, among friends, in churches or schools or workplaces or community organizations also begins by naming problematic patterns. Racism and homophobia and other patterns of systemic injustice can be unlearned, but only if we identify them. Bullies thrive when people say things like, oh, that's just how so-and-so is, as a way to excuse inappropriate behavior. Negativity can be healed by developing common goals to solve things which are controllable and agreeing together to accept those things which cannot be changed. The snakes in the room become much less poisonous once you look at them and go, oh, look, a snake. Healing is often a complicated process that takes lots of time and attention, love and prayer. But it usually begins, as this story suggests, by looking at what has wounded you and letting that long glance begin the healing process. Rumi, a 13th century Persian poet and Sufi mystic, writes this in his longer poem, Childhood Friends. Trust your wound to a teacher's surgery. Flies collect on a wound. They cover it. Those flies of your self-protecting feelings, your love for what you think is yours. Let a teacher wave the flies away and put a plaster on the wound. Don't turn your head. Keep looking at the bandaged place. That's where the light enters you. And don't believe for a moment that you're healing yourself. May God bless you on your healing journey today and always. Amen.